a continuation from the seminar that we had a couple weeks ago. I know some of you guys were at it, some of you weren't, but essentially the talk was training through the aging process. So basically looking at everything we do with our adults and how, really what we can do from a coaching standpoint in terms of managing the aging that they're going through, and really just kind of adapting what we do from a training standpoint from the athlete side to the adult side. So what I said in the talk a couple weekends ago is that the reason that this is really important is because most of us get into this field is at a young age. I think the average coach here is 25. The average client that our coaches are going to train are going to be around 55. The average adult client is about 55. So it's hard to understand when you're 25 what somebody 30 years older than you is going through, right? It's hard to relate to how they feel on a day-to-day basis, some of the aches and pains that they go through. So really what I was trying to do with this talk is kind of close this gap and give us as younger coaches a better understanding of the aging process and what actually occurs. Not only so that we can, again, kind of adapt training, but also just better relate to them and again, like how they feel on a day-to-day basis. And the thing I didn't get to, during the seminar, we talked about joints and muscles in the cardiovascular system, but what we didn't get to is the bone part, just because the presentation was going to be too long. So this is what we're going to kind of cover over the next probably 15 minutes or so. Just looking at sort of how bone changes. So from a physiological standpoint, we can think about the two things that are really important is what are called osteoblasts. The best way to think of these are like cells that build up the bone. So when we're young, like young athletes, we're full of osteoblasts. You can think of this like bricklayers, right? We're just continuing to build. As we get older, the opposite end of that, osteoclasts, are things that actually reabsorb the bone as we age. So you can think of this like the demo crew. And so as we age, like there's more demolition that's going on and less of this building process that happens. And that's going to cause a ton of changes. Specifically, most of you guys have probably heard of osteoporosis, and the other one is osteopenia. So essentially what happens is the density of the bone decreases between 0.2 to 0.5% per year beginning at age 30, which you realize like age 30 is not very old for these things to start to decline. There's going to be decreased supply and absorption of calcium. So calcium is going to be primarily absorbed and stored in the bone. So there's less calcium available to us as we age. And also the calcium that we take, so I always think of like drinking milk and things like that, less of that is actually taken in by the bone as we age. And then there's a ton of hormonal changes. So things like testosterone goes down for women. The big one is menopause, happens right in their 60s. And this causes a huge shift in their bone health. And that sort of goes in line with decreased physical activity. So we see that all of these changes kind of happen gradually over time. There's the hormonal changes, the structural changes in bone, and combined with the decreased physical activity sort of lead us to what that picture on the right there looks like. You can see the normal bone, most of us sitting in this room right now, really tightly compact, really strong, absorbs stress really well. You can see as we age, it becomes a lot more porous, becomes very thin and very brittle. And the biggest problem with this are some of the injuries it leads to, like fractures. So we see between the ages of, right around the age of 50, no, I'm sorry, actually age of 60, 30 to 50% of women and 15 to 30% of men are going to have a fracture, particularly at the femoral neck. So you can see that picture over there on the right. The sort of top of the femur there is a very common cause. You hear about older people breaking their hip. This is actually the place where most of those fractures happen. Also really common in the spine and in the wrist. These are like the areas that are particularly susceptible to this stuff. But after the age of 60, you're 2.78 times more likely to die the year after a hip fracture. So essentially what we see is if you're over the age of 60 years old and you have a fall, it's the chance of them dying within that year is extremely high. So it becomes a really, really big problem, which sort of leads us to this quote. This was taken from a paper on the effects of bone mineral density, falls, and coronary risk factors. And it says, a recent trial investigating exercise effects on BMD, which is bone mineral density. Essentially, bone mineral density is like the how much mass there is in the bone. Reported that small 1 to 2% differences in bone mineral density, together with other exercise benefits, such as improved muscle function and balance, may reduce fracture incidences by up to 50%. So the big key takeaway with this is small changes, big results. So 1 to 2% differences in that bone mineral density. But it's not just about the actual structure of the bone. It's more, when we think about things like fractures and falls, it's more in line with the other stuff that we're getting from training, like balance, coordination, muscle strength, all of those sort of, what's up, John? All of those sort of play into the positive benefits that we get from bone. So, 3 ways to train aging bone. Number 1 is impact's going to be really important. So we think about all the stuff we do, the stuff you guys are doing. As young people, like jumping over hurdles, sprinting, all those things that are really high impact is really, really valuable when you're younger. But as you begin to age, we have to be more cautious with the types of impact we give people. So it says, findings suggest that exercise regimens comprising of moderate magnitude impacts from varying odd directions may represent the optimal mode to enhance bone structure and strength at the clinically important femoral neck. So if we go back to this one, again, like the top of the femur, the femoral neck, is going to be the most important and most vulnerable place we see a lot of these structures happen. So the big takeaway from that, moderate magnitude impacts from varying odd directions. So we want to think about things like ladder drills. Yeah, it's the best clip of all time. But when we think about like ladder drills, seems like something very simple that we just kind of toss out there and no big deal. And for young athletes, it's probably the case. Like it's not extremely useful in a lot of cases. But when we think about older populations, this is why we have ladder drills in the adult program so much, because it gives us those moderate impacts from varying odd directions. We can move forward in the ladder, we can move side to side. Watch this one more time. We can cross the midline, right? It's also coordination, it's balance. All of those things that are so useful from not only a muscular standpoint, but also from a bone health standpoint. Number 2, train like athletes. So we noticed a lot of the stuff we do with our adults is not a huge difference in terms of the actual lifts. We're not going to do things like Olympic lifts, but lower body training, single leg training is going to be a huge priority because of the way it loads the hips and the pelvis. So we know that we can get greater loads through that femoral neck and through the hips by doing things like lunges and single leg squats. And the other great thing about this is we don't need to load it as much, because what I mentioned in the piece about muscles as they age is that increased load as people get older isn't always the most useful thing, because the muscles are more susceptible to injuries, the joints and the ligaments are more susceptible to injuries. So we want to find ways to challenge them and strengthen them without adding more and more load. So this is where the single leg training becomes a huge benefit. There's also going to be a lot of deceleration in these exercises, so things like lateral squats, lunges. Again, we can go moderate impacts and also some varying odd directions. So we can go lateral lunges, we can go forward lunges, reverse lunges. It's all going to work on balance and coordination, 3 planes of motion. So tons of benefits from a bone, not only a muscle standpoint, but from a bone standpoint as well. And then grip strength. This is something that we don't often think about a lot of times in terms of the actual benefit of grip strength. But this quote from another paper said, noteworthy is the consistent relationship between grip strength and, again, a bone mineral density and osteoporosis. In a systematic review, all 11 studies confirmed a relationship between decreased hand grip strength and the increase or incidence of hip fractures. So basically, grip strength is related to a ton of health markers. It's related to cardiovascular health, but with bone health and with hip fractures, you can see it's one of the most consistent relationships is this grip strength in the incidence of hip fractures. So think about particularly things like loaded carries are going to be really useful. So we think about in-place marches like you see Yvette doing here. Just having them hold on to weights for long periods of time. Suitcase carries. There was a study from Stuart McGill. He did a paper on the highest hip loads and the highest spinal loads actually happen when we have an offset kind of suitcase carry. Things like mace carries, bottoms up carries, sandbag carries. This stuff that's always going to be in the adult program at some point because we're working on grip strength, but we're also working on, again, loading the hips, loading the pelvis, core stability, and then also starting to think about standards. So if you look at the program I just gave you guys, one of the things we implemented this month is trying to push carries a little bit more with our adults. So working on 50 to 75% body weight for up to 90 seconds. That was the functional capacity screen from Gray Cook, had that as their standard. I've done it with a couple of the clients. The biggest thing with this is it really makes a difference on what you're carrying. So, I mean, we can try some of this stuff later, but carrying dumbbells are significantly harder than carrying kettlebells. The trap bars work really well for carries. In the summer, we'll do our staff Olympics. We have the body weight carry. It's always done with the trap bar. So the actual implement you carry matters a lot. But I think trying to push this stuff a little bit more, because what we'll see with the adults is with something like a carry, they'll just grab whatever kettlebell's closest, right? And they're not thinking about like, all right, I'm going to push this like I would push a squat or something like that. But when we see the benefits it has from grip standpoint and also bone standpoint, it's probably something we want to focus a little bit more on. And then this is a big part is start young. So, yeah, Katie, you remember this? Yeah.
They're so good.
Yeah.
And they're so much better now.
So this is an interesting part because this is something nobody thinks about when they're younger is bone health. Like this is probably the furthest thing from your guys' minds. Maybe with was it a wrist fracture? What happened?
It was a scaphoid.
Okay, all right. So you might be thinking about it a little bit more than other people. But
Yeah.
The biggest thing is when we're young is the time to actually put bone in the bank. As Pat Van Galen said, Pat was our guest at the winter seminar. She had deposits in the bone bank. The reason for this is that when we're younger, this is when the bone is most receptive to actually growing, both growing in length, but also in strength and in density. Versus once the bones stop growing, that's when the decline starts to happen. So the stronger we can make them at younger ages, bone matures between the ages of 18 and 25. So that's really the time to think about like, okay, how much can we train? How strong can we get? Because this is stuff that's really going to come in handy later on in life. So again, 90% of bone mass is achieved by 18. So I think you guys have already basically achieve 90% of what you'll have for the rest of your lives. But this is the time to do the stuff that we wouldn't necessarily do with our older clients, like continuous jumps and sprinting and hang cleans. And this makes a lot of sense from an athlete training standpoint because there's not as much wear and tear on the joints. There's not as much breakdown of the muscle, and they can handle some of these higher loads that we might not want with some of our older clients. So jump, throw, sprint, and lift. These are going to be the big things that you guys see we focus on every single day. Progressive resistance, so just adding a little bit of weight every single week. Really, again, pushing strength at a younger age. Again, because this is the time to do it. There's less wear and tear, and the benefits we can get from a bone standpoint are huge. And then number 3, I sent you guys this article. I can send you guys too. But Kevin wrote a really good article for strengthcoach.com called Osteoporosis, the Importance of Strength Training for Women of All Ages. But when we think about all of this stuff with bone is really, it's a long game. So it's not, most of the benefits we don't see for at least 8 months, and that's with very consistent training. So this isn't something, you can lift for a couple weeks and all of a sudden you get stronger bones. It's really a long-term project. The most important thing though is again to start young. So when we're young, that's when we want to make as many deposits in the bank in terms of adding strength, adding the bone mineral density, and increasing the resilience of the bones. Because when we're older, really like you saw starting as young as 30, these things start to decline. So with our adults, rather than thinking about trying to build up the bone, we're really just thinking about trying to minimize the breakdown. That's where most of the benefits are seen. And then there's a huge nutrition component to all this. So Kevin talks about more about this in his article, but I didn't want to make this too long. So the nutrition piece is massive. Things like vitamin D, calcium, even things like salt intake. There's a big link between all of those and what happens with the bones. So again, we think about from the youth training standpoint, like getting the athletes to think a little bit about the nutrition, to eat a little bit better, to do the things when they're younger, to make as many deposits as possible is going to go a really, really long way.